Welcome to This Explainer. We are jumping right into a massive, highly consequential debate today. It's all about this. Should a government step in and intervene when its national currency is suddenly in freefall? I mean, this isn't just some abstract theoretical economic stuff. It's a question that literally dictates the cost of living, the survival of domestic businesses, and honestly, the stability of the broader global economy. You see, in a pure free market, currencies are supposed to just fluctuate based on millions of daily trades, right? But what happens when those fluctuations become extreme? Does the state have a duty to step in as a protector? Well, we're going to break down both sides of this argument by looking at a recent, highly structured debate on this exact topic.
To really wrap our heads around the sheer scale and urgency of this issue, let's talk about a recent real-world example. $40 billion. Seriously, let that number sink in. In April of 2026, the Japanese government dropped roughly that staggering amount of money in a single day. Their goal? To actively manipulate the yen's price and stop its rapid downward slide by aggressively buying yen and selling dollars. That is a massive, absolutely historic deployment of national reserves, and it perfectly sets the stage for our discussion today. Because when a government throws $40 billion at a market in 24 hours, we really have to ask, is this a reckless use of resources or an absolute, non-negotiable defense mechanism?
So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the record weak yen and the state's intervention. Then, we'll cover the pro-intervention argument, viewing it as a market safety valve. After that, the counter-argument that it's just not a root solution. We'll then examine these clashing perspectives head-to-head. And finally, wrap up with the ultimate question: what is the government's true role? Okay, part one. Let's look at the record weak yen and the reality of state interventions. Now I want you to focus on this number, 163.99, because despite that massive April intervention we just talked about, by July 2026, the yen had hit this historic low against the US dollar. And if you're living in a heavily import-reliant economy, this isn't just a squiggly line on a financial chart going the wrong way. It is an immediate, severe hit to everyday purchasing power. Almost overnight, the daily cost of imported groceries, energy to heat your home, and raw materials for local factories just skyrockets. It deals a really heavy blow to everyday citizens and small businesses who simply can't absorb those costs.
Let's actually trace how this all played out. Following that initial $40 billion shock-and-awe intervention on April 30th, the relief was painfully short-lived. The yen just kept sliding, eventually hitting that 163.99 mark by July. Things got so intense that it actually forced a highly unusual joint intervention by both the US and Japan later that month. And sure, it temporarily rebounded the currency to around 155, but the whole sequence of events forces a really uncomfortable question. Even in a crisis, should a government be actively trying to manipulate prices in a supposedly free market?
Which brings us to part two, the pro-intervention stance, or what we can call the safety valve argument.
The affirmative side in this debate uses a really compelling medical metaphor to make their case. They describe foreign exchange intervention as first aid for acute symptoms. It's actually a great way to think about it. Look, they readily concede that structural economic reforms and monetary policy shifts are the long-term cures for a weak currency. No one is denying that. But if an economy is literally hemorrhaging due to a sudden, violent market shock, you have to apply a tourniquet to stop the bleeding first, right? You can't start physical therapy on a patient who is actively bleeding out. In their view, sitting back and doing absolutely nothing during a panic is a flat-out dereliction of government duty.
So the affirmative side essentially builds their case on three core pillars. First, intervention directly protects citizens' purchasing power from debilitating imported inflation. Second, it acts as a safety net, basically throwing a net over excessive, highly leveraged market speculation that drives prices away from reality. And third, absolutely crucially, it buys central banks the clock time they desperately need to actually figure out and implement those long-term structural reforms. They are very careful to emphasize here. They aren't advocating for the government to permanently fix the exchange rate. They just want a temporary safety valve to protect everyday people from destructive economic shocks.
Let's flip the coin. Part 3. The con side. Defending free markets and arguing that intervention is fundamentally flawed.
The negative argument centers on one very harsh macroeconomic reality. Intervention simply cannot fix the fundamental US-Japan interest rate gap. That gap is the core issue. Throwing tens of billions of dollars at the global foreign exchange market is essentially treating a symptom while completely ignoring the underlying disease. As long as there is a massive disparity in interest rates between Japan and other major nations, the basic economic fundamentals are going to keep pushing the currency down. So, the argument goes, eventually, the sheer weight of the global market is going to overpower any artificial government intervention anyway.
Opponents also point out some really severe secondary risks to jumping into the market like this. For one, it rapidly drains a nation's limited hard-earned foreign currency reserves. It also fundamentally distorts natural price discovery. By doing that, the government is essentially cutting the wires to the market's own alarm system. Furthermore, stepping in like this unfairly punishes export companies that would normally thrive and boost the economy when their home currency is weak. And finally, it creates a very dangerous moral hazard. If investors believe there's an implicit government guarantee that will always save the day, they completely lose the incentive to properly manage their own financial risks.
Moving to part 4, let's put these two clashing perspectives right next to each other. Market versus state.
At its absolute core, this debate boils down to a profound philosophical clash between two competing priorities. On the affirmative side, the ultimate priority is market stabilization. It's the core belief that the state has a moral obligation to step in and protect consumers and society from sudden, unbearable economic pain. On the negative side, the absolute priority is market freedom. This is the insistence that an unfettered market, even a really painful one in the short term, is the only way to ensure accurate price signals and build long-term economic resilience.
When we actually put their policy proposals head-to-head, the friction is pretty obvious. Think about the policy goals. The affirmative wants to spend money to buy time during a panic, while the negative warns this just kicks the can down the road and pushes the pain into the future. When it comes to citizen relief, the pro side wants to stop price spikes right at the border through currency manipulation. The con side, however, argues that if citizens are hurting, the government should just use direct domestic subsidies and push for wage hikes instead of messing with global markets. Ultimately, it's a debate over trust. The affirmative argues that markets aren't perfect. They sometimes fail and act completely irrationally. The negative firmly insists that markets reflect true economic data, and governments have no business tampering with that reality.
So, how did the judges actually evaluate this clash of ideas? Let's get into part 5, the government's true role and the final verdict of this debate.
In this specific structured debate, the affirmative side actually took the win. And they did it by masterfully reframing the concept of intervention. They successfully convinced the judges that it wasn't some arrogant attempt at price fixing by the government, but rather a necessary emergency triage. They backed this up with hard, documented evidence showing the real-world economic harm caused by unchecked volatility. Plus, they aligned their stance with the realistic everyday practices of modern central banks around the world. The winning move was their clarification that they fundamentally accept the free market, but just require a safety net during unprecedented shocks. That nuance was enough to push them over the edge for the win.
But while that formal debate might have a declared winner, the global economic tension at the heart of this issue is far from resolved. Think about it. If the yen, or your own national currency wherever you're living, were to suddenly plummet tomorrow, should the state step in? Is the short-term protection of citizens' wallets really worth the long-term risk of distorting free markets and draining national reserves? It's an incredibly delicate balance of market freedom and government duty, and one that is absolutely going to continue shaping our global economy. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning the consensus, keep learning, and I will see you next time.